Welcome to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
Urban Fae, Banshee in the City, Part 3. Apparently I'd hurt two muggers badly enough that they decided to let me go. I rose and turned towards the much more dimly lit property in the street beyond. There was another solid wall to my right, and a long run to the next fence line and freedom. I set out at a fast walk, careful of where I stepped, least until I heard the thumping of feet and the low growls and panting of serious guard dogs. Not foolishly barking watchers, but guardians, who spoke with fangs and claws. I knew that dogs were faster than me, and that if I ran, I'd only die tired. So I turned and froze in a defensive posture, the long blade held in front of me like a boar spear. A whistle sounded, and then a shouted command. A pair of large forms swept past me, turned back toward my rear flank, and stopped in their tracks. Beams of light stabbed at my eyes from the back porch, and a voice called, "Do as I say, and they won't harm you. They are well trained. Walk over to me slowly, and keep those blades at your side." My choices were limited, so I complied. When I drew near the edge of the back porch, an old-style cover type that extended directly from the house, I could make out a shadowy figure that hovered behind the fixtures that held the glaring lights. I quickly glanced to either side and saw a pair of enormous Rottweilers grinning savagely, giving me glances that said, "Please do the wrong thing. We just want eine kleine nibble." "Close enough," the reedy void said. "Put the blades on the floor of the porch, then step back 2 paces. Once again I complied. "Now," Reedy asked, "what's your story?" I was a scratch that, a great liar. But in this case, the truth would be easier. Likely this person had encountered thugs of many varieties and would understand my actions. I was at the bus stop over on the next block. 2 guys tried to rob me. I don't know why, not like I have anything. I was just passing through. I wasn't sure anyone lived in this place. My captor cackled. "You have a pair of knives, and one of them is extremely valuable. Can't believe you'd let someone make you surrender them so easily. You caught 2 criminals, but let 2 mere dogs stop you? Why, each of them barely weigh as much as you do." The voice cackled some more. The silhouette turned and rummaged for a moment. Then a dark-colored towel landed on my blades. "Best clean those before the gore dries too much. Won't hurt the long one, but the wee claw will rust. Once they're sheathed, you may come in. The back door will be unlocked. Unlikely the police will show, but you really don't want those robbers finding you once they recover." I once more found myself doing as I was told. I was getting weak in my old age. The gore was dark and had already thickened as it congealed. It didn't look like blood. I climbed the back stairs, and the bright lights no longer glared. But from the windows on the back of the house, there was a more welcoming glow cast by modern interior lighting. I could see that my new 4-legged companions had returned to their patrol duties, but still cast wistful, hungry glances in my direction. I wasn't sure what I expected. Something out of a cheesy horror movie, maybe. But the old house had been modernized, and the kitchen was a very modern looking. There was a small breakfast table towards the interior of the house, and seated on the far side, in a bright yellow robe with pink furry trim at the wrists and collars, sat my host, I suppose. I wasn't sure what sex the being was. It wore a bright pink coiffure that matched the robe lining over a narrow grayish face. There were more wrinkles on the skin than lines on a city map. The robe was voluminous and obscured any hint of a figure beneath it. 2 steaming cups sat on either side of the table, one clearly intended for me. A long-fingered hand gestured for me to make myself comfortable. Had it only been 3 fingers and a thumb? I wondered in silence, then mentally shrugged. Not the strangest thing I'd encountered in my life. I put on my winning smile. Thank you. I really could use a moment to regain my calm and warm up a little. I took the proffered seat and left it pulled away from the table slightly. I cocked one leg and planted the ball of the other foot on the floor, ready to spring. Always had to be ready for trouble. The being said nothing, just sipped from the steaming mug. Definitely 3 long fingers and a long thumb. Maybe an extra thumb or dew claw? Thick, black nails. I did my best to keep my attention on the eyes, large and yellow, set wide on a face, and the pupils were slits like that of a cat. I realized that we were playing the silent game, and as the guest, I must speak first. My name is Rob. I was trying to get back home on the city bus. Someone took my bike a while back. Probably stupid to think I'd be able to find it. Still, it was a nice one and my best means of transportation. I paused for an internal eye roll. Surely this person did not want to hear inane babble. Look, I cut those 2 guys. One of them hit me and the other had a pistol, a pretty small one. It looked like a starter pistol, but I simply reacted when I saw it. I lopped off his hand and cut the other across the groin and upper thigh. I didn't stop to look, but it felt like a pretty deep gash. I looked down at my clothes, now splattered with the same dark gunk that had coated my blades. I didn't have anything else to tell, so I stopped. My host continued to watch my features in silence. I decided to take a sip of my drink to signal that it was my host's turn to speak. The mouth split into a wide grin, a little too wide, that exposed sharp teeth and needle-like fangs, one of which had been broken and re-sharpened. The short, blunt nose twitched. Interesting, Rob. Probably best to avoid using your true name when speaking to the denizens of Otherworld. Rob works as well as anything and speaks to your nature. For instance, you may call me Matchka. Not sure how you'd spell that in English, but I think you have a good ear for languages and accents, yes? I nodded and took another sip of hot tea. So, you are of Otherworld? Most of the time. This home is a way station. Below a portal, you may have noticed that the yard slopes away from the house. Not many tall hills in the city, but enough of one to serve. Ah, my young one, there's so much for you to learn. Another lesson, for instance, is that you should not take food or drink offered in Otherworld. It will trap you there for varying lengths of time. Well, maybe not. We've yet to determine your true nature, haven't we? I heard the laugh, as though it came from the far end of a very long tunnel. The face that now loomed above me was obscured around the edge of my vision, grayed. I had truly gotten stupid once I tried to go straight. The darkness eventually lessened. No light, simply less blackness. Noises impinged on my hearing as I swam slowly towards consciousness. I could not understand the language, but after a moment I could clearly perceive speaking. The darkness had turned to gray and light and now leaked into my periphery. I felt weak, my limbs heavy yet lightened. All too slowly they lightened. Finally, words that I could make out struck me. A reedy voice. Master, her friend awakens. A deep, masculine voice responded. Well done, Matchka. He would listen but not hear if we simply warned him. Sometimes the young can be slow-witted. A shadowy and massive form loomed over me. The light in the room, or wherever I was, remained dull, and its source was behind the figure, so I could not make out the features. A large hand, hard with firm flesh, seized my chin and cheeks and shook my head. "Come on out of it. You claim to be a coyote, not an opossum." I widened my eyes and found that my throat was painfully dry, but I managed to croak out a response. "What do you want with me?" A deep chuckle rumbled from the broad-shouldered figure. "Sensible enough question. I expected some uhs and a why, perhaps whining and sniveling, or at best a where am I? Well done, youngling. Perhaps we will let you live. As for what we want you to do a better job surviving. Instead of wandering around a dangerous area, you should be home studying the books that our servant gave you. Apparently you need clear and personal direction, and the result of this exercise were an example of the wages of ignorance." I sat up, all the while expecting to engage restraints, or to have the hulking male or the freaky pink Catwoman thing push me back supine. Yet the shadowy forms faded backwards, and I sat easily and swung my legs over the edge of a couch. Weird. Too many movies and lurid novels, I thought. I'd expected some sort of mad scientist's lab table. The others assumed seats in large chairs across the room from me, though the arrangement of the lighting kept the big fellow in the shadows. So, are we enemies or friends? I just awakened and I was never at my best after sleeping. Silence for an uncomfortably long time. I knew how to play this game, though. I dug in my very stubborn nature and refused to speak. I wanted to. I wanted to demand answers, or perhaps play the humor card and make some goofy comments to elicit useful responses. But instead, I clamped down on my impulse and instead used the quiet time to reflect on my situation and to study my potential foes. I found that I had not been disarmed. Foolish if they were enemies, even if they didn't consider me a serious threat. They should have taken no chances. I was still alive and, as far as I could tell, unharmed. Another point for non-enemies. I'd been drugged and dragged into this room and threatened. A mark in the enemies column. The last thing I recalled seeing before the tea knocked out my lights was the creature who'd fed me the tea, standing in her robes slipping open. The pink trim turned out to be fur that covered most of her, and well, I assumed she was a she because of the 4 boobs she sported, 2 over 2, like a cat. Now she sat in one of the chairs, sans robe, her feet tucked beneath her wrong-way jointed legs and tail wrapped around the feet. Her features were still inscrutable. Definitely a cat-ish being. She stared. No curiosity, no emotion. Just stared with those big golden orbs with the vertical slit pupils. The big man, who knew what these otherworld types, sat, his fingers steepled as far as I could tell, just stared with eyes. It had finally registered what was so odd about him. The eyes glowed a deep blue, a similar hue to my own, but with an inner light. They flashed brightly for the briefest moment and then dimmed back to normal orbs. Better than expected. You assumed and used the silence rather than attempt to lie, bluster, or babble your way to answers. Perhaps you may get a few. We are neither friend nor foe at this juncture. You are not a captive, if that's what you fear. You may leave at any time. Yet, If you remain for a short while, we will speak. In our doing so, you will find answers. Perhaps they will be useful, even life-preserving, or perhaps they will distress you. Make your choice. I sat still and once again turned my thoughts inward. Leaving would be dumb. Outside of the dimly lit parlor or salon or whatever you call the room, everything was dark. That Stygian gloom I'd learned to fear and loathe. Any kind of monster could be lurking. And this could all be some silly game that these beings played for their own deviant purposes. In the end, I felt that he wanted to talk, to answer some questions, to guide me maybe, as Mr. G had in the end been unable to do. I'd like to speak, but may I please have something to drink? Preferably unadulterated. Machka slowly unfolded from her perch and slinked her way into the darkness. She shortly returned with a sealed can of energy drink. I thanked her. It was cold and tasted too sweet and piquant all at once, but it would suffice. She resumed her perch on the chair and licked at her hands before she resumed her inscrutable stare. I really hope she doesn't start licking cat parts. I got off the stray thought. The big fellow had shifted. He placed his hands on the arms of the chair. The two with whom you fought this evening were chasers, not particularly bright beings, but tenacious to a fault. Before you ask, they were not members of the hunt. These are separate beings, usually entrepreneurs, scavengers from their betters. Pretty much any sentient is better, but in this case, they may have been set to purpose by another. You must learn to properly see the world as it is, rather than how you assume it to be. It takes some concentration, and initially, the realities of this realm and other world will overlap in a confusing manner. The mortal fools around us can be dangerous when we step into their world. However, you must learn that their petty lives are meaningless. We come here for our own purposes, to take their resources and to hone our skills against them, rather than hurt one another. The worlds are connected through portals, mostly below ground or underwater, since the mortal savages kill, burn, and or bury everything they consider a threat. His features soured as he spoke of the mortal savages of which I was a part. Or was I? There had to be a reason he spoke of us as separate. He continued, some simple rules for your survival. 1. Be hospitable to all, but be cautious when you accept hospitality. Consuming food or drink in Otherworld may trap you, like it did tonight. 2. Stay above ground unless you must retreat below, as you wisely did from the troll. Nasty beasts. That encounter should encourage you to resume your martial skills practice. Perhaps add in a long-distance weapon. The underside leads most often to the dark lands of Otherworld unless you know how to find your way. 3. Stay out of the water until you are ready. Stay far from it if you can. Once you are ready, water will be your ally. 4. Machka warned you about names. Your parents called you their coyote, so that you could safely give a sobriquet rather than your actual name. 5. Avoid taking anything from Otherworld into this one unless it is freely given by the rightful owner. If you steal treasure, it will melt away in the sunlight or turn into something unpleasant like dung. 6. Beware the washers at the fords or bridges or fountains. They presage doom and death. Do not try to harm them or interfere with what they do. There are many more rules and skills to learn. Read your books and practice your skills. You will need to be prepared for your next encounter. Some being bears you ill will and would harm you, or take you back to Otherworld to stay as a prisoner. You will need to find a way to wear your other treasures. They will protect you from many harmful actions by mortals and by some Otherworld denizens, like the 2 chasers who attacked you and will be stalking you presently. It is difficult to stay focused on preparations when the efforts are perpetual and the threats seem ever delayed. Yet you must constantly prepare. You have enemies from both worlds, though none are currently in this room. He stood. It's time for you to return. The other world is not geographically aligned with the mortal world any more than it is temporarily synchronous. When you exit, you will find that only a small time has passed, and your pursuers are closer than you would want. With that, my personal world shifted, spun out of control for a moment, and then I was on the sidewalk outside of the fence, where I'd intended to go when I fled the bus stop. The house inside the fenced area was now completely dark. No dogs barked, and it looked rather abandoned, shabby, and with holes in the roof and a few broken window panes. A ruin rather than a nicely maintained older home I had visited. Fae Ban. I wondered if the entire sequence of events had been a hallucination, something I'd often wondered in recent months. Then reality rushed to meet me as 2 figures that had been approaching down the sidewalk suddenly sprinted towards me with angry screeches. It was the 2 jackers, the chasers, one-handed scrambler and ballless cigarette guy who quickly fell behind in the charge, limping and hobbling. I quickly filled my hands with cold steel and faced them. The move surprised them. They had maybe expected another trick or for me to flee, but I faced them head on. I even managed to take a few steps in their direction. Forewarned is forearmed, I thought grimly, and gave silent thanks to my weird benefactors. One-handed scrambler very courteously scrambled right up onto the big blade. As it slit into his soft, ice-cold innards, I quickly drew the sharp little claw across his throat. Otherworld creeper not. That should do it for him, I decided. As I pushed his limp and no longer screeching form to the ground, he had been prepared to attack, but forgotten he was missing a hand. Not bright. Ballless cigarette guy arrived and had every reason to be pissed, though his injuries may have given him some problems with that function. He stopped and squared off, angrily hissing at the body of his partner that I had casually discarded in front of him to block his way. He was stupid but agile enough and managed to avoid tripping as he stepped over his friend, to follow my feint as I stepped backwards and assume an expression of terror. I stepped forward again and caught him mid-stride. I pushed him so that this time he did indeed trip over his counterpart, and again sliced open his thighs with the longer blade and rammed the point of the short claw into his guts. Where I left it once, he was sprawled on his back. Still hissing and screeching at me, I maintained my grip on the little blade and felt the coldness seep upward from the inside of him. There was some slowly seeping ichor that oozed from his wounds rather than spraying as would proper blood. I still had stains from it on my jacket. "Who sent you?" I asked over his wails of pain and fear. His sounds remained incoherent, so I twisted the claw and ripped it upward where I assumed his vitals would be. Just a hair, but it was clearly painful to him. "Answer my questions, or there will be more pain. Much more." I threatened him and meant it. "Stop!" he hissed out between his small teeth, like baby teeth that had been filed into fish fangs. "I will tell. It was the she, a woman. Ah!" Surprisingly, as with those dumbasses, hood rats, this short response made more sense than it should have. I'd already been warned about the banshee. One was apparently out to get me. I went to ask another question, but the creature had fallen limp. Clearly, it had something vital near where I'd stabbed it or slashed it. His companion had mostly melted away into a dark sludge inside of mortal clothing beneath him, and he was soon melting and merging with the other mess. Disgusting, I thought. Stinks like low tide at the wharf. Time to find another bus. In the end, I didn't bother waiting at the next bus stop. It had gotten late and the buses had stopped running. As I passed one and took a rueful glance, I noticed that it was near the bridge over the main bayou that ran through the city. A long bridge. I worried that the troll may have changed neighborhoods or had a relative. A larger relative who dwelled under this span. It was well lit. I waited for the light to dim and herd me towards a violent end. But they continued glowing, their urine-hued glow accompanying me to the apex of the bridge. I slowed and looked down at the water, and instinctively clutched at the hilt of my big blade. I saw nothing but heard a surprisingly sweet melody chanted from below, like a camp for those with no better options. Yet the tune was haunting and the voice exquisite. It was accompanied by splashes and the sound of material rubbing against a hard, rough surface, then being slapped against the surface. I couldn't make myself look. I hunched my shoulders, stuffed my hands into my pockets, and stepped forward at a quickened pace. Unfortunately, we cannot outpace fate. The keening wail raked my nerves as a pitiless rider rakes his spurs on a worn mount. I reacted as the horse would. I ran. I soon had to slow in my panic. I'd forgotten to breathe for running, and my lungs and diaphragm now pulled raggedly at the thick air of the urban jungle. I slowed to a walk. It was silly to run from mere waves of sound, no matter how awful they made me feel. I'd made it across the water. For some reason, that was a comfort to my disjointed thoughts. It had been a long, weird evening and night. I discovered that 2 of my friends were dead. Not dear to me, but 2 of the few I respected in the old hood. I was on high alert the rest of the way home. I hadn't seen the washer at the ford, or bridge in this case, so I was not likely doomed at present, but someone was. The sound had come from close by, so probably someone close. Sadly, I was right. I felt an even deeper sorrow fall over me as I approached the neighborhood on the edge of the urban blight. When I saw the flashing lights and heard the wail of sirens, a sound almost as forlorn as that of the washers, I jogged forward, despite the weariness in my body and soul. These people were as close to me as any living. There were police vehicles and a couple of ambulances. I craned my neck and searched around through the mass of people in the scene, but I could not locate the Hearns. I knew that it would be better to face the music now and hopefully get some answers, though my instincts developed over the past several years screamed at me to avoid the po-po. I used what I had learned among the nasties of humanity to decipher which officer was in charge. A direct appeal would reduce the amount of time and hassle I'd face and ensure that I had to tell my story only once. That would make it easier should any lies or misdirection be required. "Good evening, Lieutenant," I greeted the harried-looking middle-aged woman with a blade of a face, not ugly, just sharp features. "My name is Robert McIntyre. I live here with the Hearns. What happened? Are they all right?" She looked me over in the way that officers assess a person, deciding what I was before she worried about whom. "Good evening, sir. I'm Lieutenant Falk. Do you have any identification?" I did, and without delay, but avoiding sudden moves, I produced my driver's license. I'd adjusted my ironmongery so that the weapons were not immediately visible, though if she wanted to pat search me, I'd be in for another run. "Thank you, ma'am. Please, are they hurt? Is one of them sick or something?" My questions were half pretense and half sincere. I very well knew something was dreadfully wrong, but people typically act as though they had no clue when they were in the early stages of denial. I did my best to mimic that response and stood there gaping slightly and trying to add confusion to my studied look of worry. Poor dumb kid. She handed my driver's license to another officer and told him to run it, then looked back at me. "Mr. McIntyre, where were you? This evening?" She obviously didn't buy my act. Crap. It would be easiest if I told the truth-ish. I went out to inquire after my missing bicycle. I met up with some old associates and then found I'd stayed out past the bus schedule. I deliberately left out that I'd stopped at Bayview. I wanted her to ask so she'd feel like she was accomplishing some investigative talk. Besides, it might look sketchy that there had been an incident over that way. "I noticed on your DL that you're under age 21. That place is sexually oriented business with an alcoholic beverage permit. Who'd you visit?" I shrugged. "Friends. I know a few of the girls from my foster home days. The security guy, Papa Boo Boo, is a buddy. I don't know his real name." She eyed me skeptically and was about to speak when the other officer returned with my driver's license. "He's clear, ma'am, and this is his listed address." She nodded. "Did you see or hear about the incident at Bayview?" I nodded. "It was terrible. Happened just before I arrived. I'd met the lady before. She was my friend's boss. I hung out to see what happened, but nobody wanted to talk. Kind of a bummer night." "So you have no idea what occurred here?" she asked suspiciously. Her interest had been piqued. I'd known that it would be. I was prepared. Truth, again, me. However, the best lies contain elements of veracity. "No, ma'am. Like I said, I just returned home. Please, are Mr. and Mrs. Hearn okay?" I raised my voice slightly, adding a hint of frustration. I felt it, and she needed to hear it. Somewhere inside that vast jumble of sarcasm and skepticism that is the mind of a cop, she made a decision. "Well, no, they're not. Look, we usually let a chaplain or someone else inform people, but Mrs. Hearn, she is deceased. Mr. Hearn is in the hospital with serious injuries. We have contacted their son Richard, and he is on his way as soon as he can get a flight. You may want to secure the premises and go visit Mr. Hearn." I gave her the, "Seriously, you're not going to say how they were injured" look? She sighed. "You really don't know?" I made her face the wall of silence I had used so effectively earlier in the evening. She caved, much faster than the otherworldly beings had. "It was a drive-by. Not your friends, but another crew. They were in a very nice purple sedan with a big cat's spots painted on the sides. Any idea who their intended target may have been? I felt terrible. I'd managed to convince the snoopy lieutenant that I had no known enemies and knew of no one who would paint a high-end sedan in purple and leopard spots. I was pretty filthy after my adventures. I was thankful that the chasers hadn't contained normal-looking blood. I'd wiped off most of the ichor, but it had an acidic quality that was unpleasant. But I was still pretty dirty. No idea what Lieutenant Falk had thought on that score. Probably assumed I'd been stealing something or handling stolen property. She was definitely familiar with Sony and company. It had to have been Jaguar's old crew that did the shooting. Certainly his old car. I should have taken it, I thought mournfully. Now they've used it to harm my family. I didn't know that enough of them were left alive to do any serious damage. Now, fully scrubbed and in nice attire, I headed towards the hospital. Mr. Hearn had been in surgery. No doubt he would be in recovery or ICU. The buses were running again, so the trip was easy. Not far, so no need to transfer. I wondered about their son, Richard. I knew of him, but we had never met in person, only online during my birthday party. The Hearns had other relatives in and around the city. Their son Bart and sister Colleen would have already arrived. There would be others on the way if Richie, as they'd referred to him, had done his family duty. He lived on the far left coast up near SeaTac, where he programmed algorithms, so it would take him a while to arrive. During the trip, I mostly worried about how the gang turds had found me. Someone had to have either surreptitiously tailed me or had done some stellar homework. I didn't think anyone had snitched, after all. No one in the hood discussed where they lived unless they were in a personal relationship. The cars. I realized that the cars from the first part of the hunt had been found outside of the neighborhood. A little watching and they would have found me. They'd probably known since before the death of their odious leader, Jaguar. They'd been busy murdering one another for control ever since and hadn't had time to focus on revenge. Likely they had a new leader and were once more organized. Killing me would send a strong message about the ruthlessness of their new leader, whoever it was. Definitely someone from a different crew. Jaguar's bunch preferred torture, would have known better than to attack the burbs, even the seedy part where the Hearns' little home resided. Mr. Hearn was in ICU. I was able to peek in on him for a moment, accompanied by Bart. Colleen was busy making funeral arrangements for their mother. My eyes actually teared at the thought, despite my hard-hearted nature. The mister looked terrible. They'd removed his spleen and he had some pretty bad injuries. The medical staff would provide only non-committal answers. Too many lawsuits have ensured that they would not speculate. Yet they were humans and easy to read. The old man was in bad shape. His cousin and her husband arrived shortly after I did. We pretended to know one another better than we did and chatted nervously and constantly returned to the subject of Miss Molly. Poor lady. She'd been so sweet to die so violently, so senselessly. It was disturbing. The tragedy hadn't fully taken hold of my senses, yet I already missed her. Mrs. Gosling arrived that afternoon, weeping piteously after her own recent loss. Sorsha was with her, but she seemed withdrawn, less energetic than I recalled. She hung her head with her wild hair draping her features, but I thought I caught just a hint of a grin. Odd, but then to be honest, hot or not, she was a little weird. Our reunion was interrupted by the arrival of Richard and his girlfriend, Siobhan, a stunning creature who, after being introduced, spoke with each family member and friend present and seemed to say exactly what each person needed to hear. She spent more time huddled with Miss Ellie than anyone else. She gave me a strange look, but afterwards ignored me. No comfort for the outsider. Richard was nice enough, and we pretended to have heard everything about one another. I had no idea how much the Hearns had shared with his eldest. I gave as few details as possible, while still remaining polite. It was a long day and evening. More and more people arrived. I was long past my comfort level with new acquaintances. Still, I hung in until visiting hours were complete. I excused myself to Bart, Colleen, and Richard. They were each staying at the hotel across the street since the father's condition was so grave. Mrs. Gosling and Sorcia had left earlier. They'd perhaps been even more uncomfortable than even I had. I exited the lobby and started to walk past the fountain that decorated the area, just in front of the drop-off driveway. A beacon for those seeking healing. My mind rambled, inventing a pitch by the architect who sold the building plans on the idea. My attention was drawn to a figure seated on the curb of the elegant structure. A young woman with long, wild hair, clothed in a simple white shift that was far too thin for the chilly evening air. Her back was to me, and she moved her hands purposefully in the water. I knew what she was. A washer. I knew to avoid her gaze. But then I caught a glimpse of the clothes. She worked over the decorative stones. Mr. Hearn's old plaid shirt. The one he'd liked so much and wore around the house. Blood tinged the once clear water. I ignored everything that the big man and Miss Kitty, Machta, had told me and ran towards the washer. I had to stop her before she admitted that awful keening wail, before she announced the death of Mr. Hearn. "Stop! Not him!" I cried out in fear for someone else's life, a rarity for me. I saw her chin drop, her shoulders slump, and then begin to shake, almost like she was laughing. But her chin rose precipitously, and her shoulders and head thrown back. She issued the scream of the banshee. The keen that meant doom, that the Norns had cut the life string of another. The fates had changed the pattern. It was so close to where my friend lay at death's door. The old tyrant's blade, however, hovered over him. The keening wail cut through the night air and sent shards of pain through my very being. I was incapable of even crying out further protest. I stumbled to a halt and knew that it was over. If Mr. Hearn was not already gone, he soon would be. The figure hung her head again and drew in the items she'd been washing. As they lifted, the water that dripped from them was clean, but that in the pool at the fountain was tinged with crimson clouds. She wrung out the clothing and placed it in a small basket at her feet, then rose. She never turned to face me, and I belatedly recalled the warning that I should not look at her or allow her to look at me. Yet I could not let this pass. She'd been haunting me for some time and forcing me to stand by helplessly while my friends died. I could not allow this to continue. She walked towards a hedge that separated the fountain from the parking lot spaces just beyond. I found my voice and choked out angrily, "Stop! Stop now, or I will kill you where you stand!" She stopped. Her shoulders slumped for a moment, then rose to a proud, erect posture. When she turned, she did so defiantly, proudly. As her face came into view, I was at once shocked and yet not. After all, Sorcia was a strange girl. She offered me an imperious smile. "Coyote, you know so little. Once the keening is sent, the doom is sealed. There is no escape. Now that you have forced me to show my face, it will only be a matter of time before you find me washing the blood from your own clothes. I stood listening and thinking, this could not be right. The Banshee were otherworldly. Sorsha was a mortal of this realm. How could she be a washer? Mr. Gosling would have warned me, wouldn't he? Mrs. Gosling never gave a hint, only that Big Cat was a clue that she was anything other than a mortal girl. You are not of the She, Sorsha. I know your parents were mortal. You cannot be of other worlds, so you cannot be a washer. She gave a tinkling laugh. She truly was a lovely young woman, at least physically, though she now walked a little stiffly and with less sway. As I said, you know so little, Coyote. With that, she turned and walked through the hedge. I stepped closer but could see there was no opening in the vegetation. Yet she was gone. I ran back inside the hospital. I had to see if there was anything I could do. I at least wanted to be there for him. When I arrived back in the ICU wing, I saw Bart. Colleen and Richard seated in the family lounge. Siobhan was absent, but I didn't really care. I wanted to see the family, the blood kin. I was greeted by tired, grief-stricken faces, but no fresh tears of misery decorated the three countenances. Suddenly I felt like an idiot. I'd just run all the way back to the lounge, fully expecting disaster, only to find the three sitting as calmly as they could, quietly discussing plans for their mother's services. I didn't know what to say, but Bart saved me. "Hey, Rob, you forgot something." And with that he held out my jacket, which I had indeed forgot. Yeah, thanks, Bart. I know it's only been a few minutes, but any change?" I was still feeling out of sorts, expecting a doctor to pass through the doors and deliver a death notice at any moment. Again Bart took the lead. "No, he's stable, but we just have to wait. Dad's strong. He has a good chance of pulling through. Making it through tonight will be the test." I nodded, thanked him, and again said my farewells. I agreed that if he made it through the night, then he would be fine. It will have been some other party who perished. But whom? There was no one closer to me than the Hearns or the Goslings, and I barely knew the Goslings. I decided to go home and get the rest of my things. I had the feeling that the situation was about to get much worse, and it was already bad. I still didn't know what the diadem did, but I did have a nice hat that I only wore on occasion, a black bowler I'd found in a second-hand shop in the hood. It stood out, and I didn't usually like to draw attention, so I donned it only rarely. However, the diadem fit perfectly inside the sweatband, so that it was out of sight, but still on my head. The torque I simply put around my neck. My collar covered most of it, but it didn't matter, since it looked pretty good and beat wearing a tie. It was still fairly early in the evening for the city. I put on my raincoat over my nice clothes. It was pretty nice. I'd gotten it at an outlet for a high-end haberdashery, and the weather looked like it might turn wet. For some reason, I felt like dressing well, and until recently, I'd had the income to do so. I filched Mr. Hearn's keys and borrowed the car. I made my way out of the Goslings' home. I was still fairly new to driving. I'd been taught. I'd passed my test, and then I'd gone back to my bicycle. It started to rain lightly before I turned off the main road and into the lane that led past the Gosling residence. By the time I'd made it to the driveway, the rain had reduced to a cold drizzle that threatened to freeze later in the night. So quoth this raven. Thank you so kindly for stopping by my chateau, my darlings. It does mean so much to me. Please, if you have not subscribed, as many of you have not, please do so. Give me a like so I know what you would like to hear. And comment. I always love to read your comments. And special thanks to my Patreon and membership supporters. Ciao, darlings.